I want to discuss the paths that you can take in dealing with your life and the negative situations that you might find yourself in. You can identify with victimhood, become the perpetual victim, continue to refer back to your victimization. You can identify with your victimizer, which means that you either passively accept their behavior or you become the victimizer, copy their behavior, make excuses for them, remain with them, and therefore passively approve of their behavior. You can also decide to not identify with your victimizer and actually hate or dislike your victimizer. But then there's also a fourth way that you can deal with life negative events, and that is to dislike or hate the behavior, but not necessarily the victimizer. Now, let's talk about victimhood, perpetual victimhood. Have you ever met a person who led with their victimization, meaning that they came with a whole lot of excuses before you even asked them to do something, or whenever they're faced with a new challenge, or whenever they're going to enter something that they haven't done previously and they're kind of unsure of themselves, they have to bring up their past victimization. For instance, you meet someone and during your first conversation with them, they're telling you about their terrible childhood without being asked, without being prompted. It's almost like this is their ready-made speech that they give new people. They're telling you about their terrible childhood, almost like a disclaimer. Now, the problem with identifying with one's victimization is the fact that the idea of going through that is in overcoming. So if you're not able to overcome and move on, it's almost like that becomes an excuse for every mistake that you make, or every bad behavior. That becomes the excuse that you're a victim. And so identifying with victimization, identifying with victimhood gives you an excuse, but you never grow. You just have that excuse. And the sad thing is that if people don't give you feedback, if people don't say, okay, that is something that I've heard before, or I'm sick of hearing it, what happens is the perpetual victim will continue to give this story to new people because they will think that it is successful in convincing people to put up with their behavior or to cater to them because they have been victimized in the past. But what they don't know is that people are trained to be polite, and so therefore they're not going to tell you, you know what, I don't want to hear about you being a victim. I want to hear about you, about the solutions, not the victimization. But because the victim is intoxicated by this idea of being a victim, they don't need much in order to continue the cycle. Even your silence is a cue for them to continue to tell that story because they haven't received any negative feedback from it. So therefore, they receive the idea that you feel pity for them, that you will excuse their mistakes because they had a terrible childhood or whatever. So, the problems in that are clear. You don't end up growing if you're always looking for an excuse for why you haven't progressed past your victimization, and the excuse ends up being, well, I'm still a victim. So it's a fulfilling prophecy. It's like if you identify with the victim, you'll always be the victim, if only in your own mind. Now, there are also people who identify with the victimizer. And the most potent example of this that I can think of is women who have been preyed upon by men. Meaning, they've dated men who've cheated on them or misused them in some way, but they end up identifying with the predator or with their victimizer rather than other women. Meaning, they might call women stupid for, and this is the extreme. They might consider women stupid who fall for the games of men, or they might just be passive about it. Like they might have a husband who talks down about, women who fall prey to men's games, and they might, not say anything if their husband is speaking about other women in that way, because they identify with their husband and not the women. And so if their husband degrades other women or doesn't respect women in general, they feel like they're an exception, because they remember how it was to be the victim, and now they feel like they're superior to the victim because they have, the male, which is their affirmation of their worth. And so they don't identify with women who are in the same position they used to be. Now, this is a way to feel powerful and to regain your powerlessness in the past situations. And it's almost like, in identifying with the victimizer, one is regaining what they lost through being victimized. One would think. But the problem in that is that you also never move past that. You never move past your victimization. You're actually identifying with your victimization because you're going to the extreme opposite to identifying with your victimizer in order to heal the victim, in order to heal or mute the victim. So rather than dealing with what you experience, dealing with the hurt you experience, and I'm just giving one example. Because I'm a female, so I can look at it from a female perspective. And so this is just one example of how that happens, where you feel like helpless and you feel like a victim. And so in identifying with the opposite of the victim, that is a highly dysfunctional way of erasing that victim, muting that victim and seeing oneself as victorious, without having to go through the actual messy process of fully understanding, processing, and incorporating that experience. So it's better to just, identify with the victimizer and feel like, okay, I conquered that, or not I conquered that, but I'm no longer that, and to be able to look down on what you were, and in a negative way, and even maybe make fun of what you were, what you see in other women, because you're stronger. You're stronger than the other women, so you're able to feel like you've overcome something that you actually haven't. You haven't even looked at or dealt with because it's too painful to. So it's better to just identify with your victimizer in that situation. And then you also have cases of people who were molested and they grow up to be molesters and things like that. Where again, it's almost like people are trying to regain their power. They felt helpless during a period of time, and so therefore they become the victimizer in order to feel victorious, in order to conquer what defeated them earlier in life. So it's not dealing with and actually processing the experience and understanding it. Rather, it's like, okay, it's skipping over the whole process and taking the easy route of, okay, I need to be on the other team. If I lost on this team, I need to be on the other team. So the victimizer won against me, so I need to be on their team because they're on the winning team. So again, not dealing with the issue. But one can also hate the victimizer, which on the surface seems like the noble path to take. You hate the fact that this happened to you, and therefore it's like you're not becoming the bad person, and you're also not adding the burden on society of seeing you as a perpetual victim. Instead, you're fighting against this person who did this to you. You're speaking out against it, and that can be considered noble. Because it's like, I'm not going to become this. I'm not going to be a burden on society by becoming a criminal or becoming a predator or whatever. And instead, I'm going to expose them. I'm going to talk against them. I hate this. I hate, what this person represents. And I'm going to, go the moral route and not do it. So on the surface, that seems like the way to go. However, we go to the fourth path, which is actually hating the behavior, but not necessarily the perpetrator of it. So in that sense, you might have been victimized, but it leaves the door open for the victimizer to actually change. If you hate the person who victimized you, say that person was demonically possessed, say that they were immature, say that they misunderstood your actions and therefore acted in the way they acted towards you because they misunderstood something about you. Say they were insecure, say whatever, but at a later stage, they understand what they did wrong and they want to be a different person. But if you hate the victimizer, then that shuts the door to you even considering the fact that people can change and become the opposite even of what they used to be. So in hating the behavior and hating the spiritual force behind a person's actions, because we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, wickedness in high places. So in hating the behavior and hating the spiritual force that the spiritual beings that subtly manipulated the person into doing what they were doing, and hating the behavior, what manifested, what that allows for is for you to identify the behavior first. And if the behavior is shown, then and the behavior is attached to a certain person, not to deal with that person. But if they're no longer manifesting that behavior, then you can consider them anew rather than always considering them alongside the behavior that might have just been a past behavior that will never be repeated. So that leaves the door open for change and growth. But so there's the victim, there's the perpetual victim, there's the person who identifies with their victimizer, there's the person who identifies against their victimizer. And also that also, I didn't speak on that, but that also can show a lack of growth because you don't want to become fixated on a person, because if you're fixated on a person rather than a particular behavior, then you're always working against a person as like a static entity rather than looking at nuances in behavior. And honestly, if you can see other people's behavior as being the problem, then it opens the door for you to be more flexible in your own behavior, if that makes sense. Like if you think that people are always represented by past behavior, then how can you look at yourself and say, okay, I can change, So it's like opening the door for other people to change their behavior makes it more reasonable in your mind that you can also change your behavior and you're not going to always be identified with your behavior. Because I don't think most people, all people, I think, have made, mistakes and would not want to be represented for the rest of their life by a bad decision that they made. So the best route to go, again, is to hate the behavior, speak out against the behavior. When people display this behavior, it is attached to them. At that point in time, you do have to warn people about them. If someone is displaying a behavior, that behavior hasn't changed, you have to warn about the behavior, and you also have to warn people about the person. But that's why with me, like if I have, if in the past I haven't gotten along with a person and I end up seeing them later on, the first thing I assess is their behavior. I don't say, because what'll happen is, you haven't seen a person for a long time, you run into them, they ask for your phone number, so you exchange numbers, and it's like you're thinking in your mind, the last time I interacted with this person, they weren't someone who I wanted to um, continue any kind of friendship with or anything because of their behavior. So in this new interaction with them, I'm going to be judging their behavior. And what'll happen is that what I'll do is I'll say, okay, is their behavior the same as it was when I last saw them? Are they, concealing that behavior because they know that, something that they did in the past made me not want to interact with them. So are they trying to hide the behavior, or is the behavior gone? And I mean, it's easier than you might think to find out whether a person is actually changed. Just let them do the talking. Don't allow them to mirror and copy your behavior, because they're people who will, if you talk enough and they gather enough information about you, they can spit it back to you in a way that you think that their interests and your interests are the same, when all they're doing is pretty much regurgitating what you had already told them. But if you let them do most of the talking in the beginning, then they have no choice but to with no information from you to go off of, they have no choice but to be themselves. And so people usually tell themselves relatively early, and you can tell through the behavior, through their real time, through their talk, you'll know their inclinations and their opinions and stuff like that right offhand. So in looking at their conversation, their activities, their likes and dislikes, how they spend their time, you're not hating the person. You're looking at the behaviors and determining whether or not you can agree with the behaviors. So it's often confusing between identifying with the victimizer, not identifying against the victimizer, and also identifying against the behavior, because at times people can be bonded to their behavior, and other times they could be trying to pull away from the behavior. But just judge by the behavior itself. That's my suggestion. Judge by the behavior itself, and if the person can change, um, it'll come out naturally. Like, they won't have to put on a grand act. They won't come to you. When people actually change, they don't call you up usually and say, I've changed, I'm a new person. That to me is planned, an execution of a plan. They're trying to get you back in their life. When people are actually changed and they've actually become whole and independent, they don't actually need you. So you meeting up with them will usually be in chance, and in casual conversation, you'll find out, oh, they're a changed person. But usually when people aggressively try to get back in contact with you, and maybe they victimized you in the past, and they start off with, I've changed, or I was a victim in my childhood, and therefore that's why I did that. They're identifying with the victim, or they're trying to put up an act. They're still the wolf, but they're trying to put on sheep's clothing. So those are just some tips in order to judge by behavior, and to have the right kind of people in your life. But definitely don't identify with the victim, because you'll become a perpetual victim. Don't identify with the victimizer, because then you're on their level. You're just as bad as they are, even if you live with a predator, and you're old enough and have the resources to move out, and you don't, then you are going along with their behavior. So you should have no contact with people who are predators and who are victimizers, because then they pull you down with them, and you compromise your morals and your principles just being in contact and in close proximity to those people. So it's an exercise in always having to compromise. And again, you don't want to identify with the against the victimizer, because as a thinking, nuanced person, you want to be able to see people as being able to change if they can, and judging the behavior so that you're not judged for things that you've done in the past, but you're given a second chance. So people should be given a second chance if they show indications of change.